Here, standing outside of the old city cemetery for the city of Tallahassee. If you can see the historical marker here, it says Old City Cemetery. Present boundaries of the Old City Cemetery established by the Florida Territorial Council, Florida U.S. territory, from 1819 to 1845, when it became a state. It says many pioneers and their slaves were buried here, although some early Tallahasseans were buried several hundred feet east of this site. The cemetery also contains graves of Confederate and Federal troops, white and Negro, some of them fatalities from the Battle of Natural Bridge, 1865, which marked the end of the ill-fated Northern attempt to seize the capital during the war between the states. And what draws our attention here today, I think it'd be interesting to go inside the cemetery and to actually see the gravestones of the remains of these federal troops, U.S. troops, United States soldiers, white and African American, who died fighting to save the Union. Of course, Tallahassee was the capital of a so-called Confederate state. Florida, one of the 11 southern states to secede from the Union. And trivia answer, Tallahassee, though, was the only southern capital not captured by Union forces during the Civil War. Tallahassee remained in Confederate hands, the hands of the so-called Confederacy, until the Confederacy surrendered in April 1865. What's interesting, though, is in this cemetery is you'll see part of this cemetery, it's a historic cemetery, is the location for the gravestones of Union soldiers who served in the U.S. military and were part of various attempts by the Union to capture Tallahassee. Some of these tombstones mark the remains of black soldiers who fought for the United States. African American troops made up about 200,000 troops, about 10% of the entire Union military during the Civil War, and some of them were part of units sent by the United States to try to capture Tallahassee, and they are they remain here, buried in the old Tallahassee, Florida cemetery. You can imagine that this was probably controversial for black soldiers to be, especially serving for the Union, to be buried in this civilian cemetery here in Tallahassee, Florida. There's probably a story there too, a local history story about how these soldiers wound up being buried here versus, say, in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., or another a U.S. military cemetery. But they are here, they remain here. It's a fairly probably forgotten part of the city's history today, but it's a nice setting for us to contemplate and to ponder one of the kind of hidden outcomes of the Civil War. A reminder here that black soldiers did fight in the U.S. military. Of course, they were a minority, and they were buried in graves. You'll notice that most of the graves are anonymous. They don't have names on them. There's one here, William Stanton, looks like Company G, 7th U.S. Infantry here. But most of the gravestones simply say U.S. soldier. And this is something that should not be minimized. I mean, the fact that the United States, under President Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, invited black men to enlist in the U.S. military, and they did so. This is a road to citizenship for not only black men, but black people generally in the United States. It's military service. It was then, it always has been. And they died for their country. They died for their adopted country. You could say, in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, it's the rebirth of the United States. It's a new definition of American citizenship. So here in formerly Spanish Florida, you saw the video begin with the image of this magnificent live oak tree that first attracted the Spanish and then would attract the British. The British built many of their ships out of these huge live oaks. It was nice. It was a unique one part of the reason the British were so intent to keep the American colonies in the British Empire was that they could have easy access to the kinds of wood that would be the basis for the British Navy. Of course, it didn't remain that way, and Florida became was sold to the United States by Florida in 1819 on the Adams-Onis Treaty, and then becomes a U.S. territory, and then ultimately a U.S. state in 1845. And so, again, something to ponder here. You can kind of see these cemeteries, and some of them in America have these the remains of U.S. military. A lot of local communities have these places, so do search them out if there are any in your neighborhood, in Illinois or elsewhere. There's a story behind these. I think it's very appropriate here to see the American flag in front of this anonymous U.S. soldier who gave his life fighting for the Union and fighting for probably personal liberty and fighting for the salvation of